Everyone, and welcome to Denver Startup Week 2020. I'm Connor Swanson, the Developer Track Chair and member of our Denver Startup Week Organizing Committee. Thank you for joining us for our first ever virtual Denver Startup Week. If 2020 has taught us anything, it's that we are more powerful when we come together as a community to share ideas and help make each other better. And here we are virtually showing the world what Denver is made of. At Denver Startup Week, we strive to make all of our sessions a space where attendees can connect, learn, and grow, regardless of gender identity, gender expression, race, ability, sexual orientation, and the combination of those identities. There's something for everyone at DSW. Thank you for joining us. With that, I want to reiterate my thanks to all of our Denver Startup Week sponsors, and specifically Quizlet, our developer track sponsor, for helping make this week possible. I'd now like to introduce you to Andy Ennamorato and Hital Shah, who will be leading this session. Thanks so much.
Hey there, everybody. I'm getting an echo, so give me 1 second to find and nuke that. Let's see, hopefully that's better. How's everybody doing today? Hopefully great. Cool. I'm going to share my screen and hit play. You're going to see a slightly different version of myself, different t-shirt, because we pre-recorded these videos so we could have no Zoom hijinks. So let me know if something goes wrong, can't hear anything, and we'll be in the Q&A and happy to chat in the middle of the presentation, or you can save it for the end and we can chat more then too. Let's see if we can figure this out. Sounds like maybe you can't hear the video. Give me a second here. Share computer sound should work. All right, here we go. Hello. And we're really lucky, I think, that we're in an industry that can be so remote friendly. And I'm just so glad that Denver Startup Week 2020 is still going, even virtual. Give me a second here. Just a reminder that on the other side of your screen is a human. I think being part of the community and being kind and empathetic. And we're really lucky Startup Week we're in an industry. I want to call out the Denver Startup Week Code of Conduct and goals for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. It's a great reminder that if you're in a startup software company, hopefully you're doing well. There's a lot of folks in other industries that may not be, so be kind to each other. Say hi to someone you don't know this week. A little bit tougher to do when you're not in person, but hope you get the chance and lift up those around you. I want to say thank you to Quizlet, who's sponsoring the developer track, helping make all this happen. It's what you're here for, right? The developer track. In this talk, making a list, checking it twice, a software checklist manifesto. My name's Andy. Go by virtual Andy on the internets. I work at Handshake as an engineering manager. And I just want to call out the original pioneer of contactless delivery, Santa. Never had to see Santa, and his presents showed up. Thanks, Santa, for making that happen all those years. Chances are, if you're watching this talk or following up on it later, that you're here at Denver Startup Week because you work at a startup or maybe a small company. And startups are complex. You often do a lot. Stack Overflow did a survey earlier this year, over 65,000 respondents, I believe. About 45% of those said they worked at a company that was 99 people or less. Chances are, if you worked at a company of that size, you're doing a lot, wearing a lot of hats. You have a lot of responsibilities. Maybe you're an engineer who also does design. If you're a designer who writes some code, if you're a product owner, I know you're talking to support. Maybe you are the support team as well. If you're executive, I'm sure you're doing business development, and maybe you're also helping out support. And this idea of systems and complexity and lots of responsibilities is intertwined with some excellent stories in this book, The Checklist Manifesto by Dr. Atul Gawande. And I came across this book and read it and thought, you know, that really applies to software and has applied in my career. If only I had known. So I hope to highlight a couple great things from the book and a couple concepts for you to take back to your own startup or even enterprise company. The 2007 New Yorker article that Dr. Gawande wrote is really a great introduction. If you don't have time for the full book, highly recommend checking out that article. It's a good one. You'll enjoy it. In the book, Dr. Gawande says the volume and complexity of what we know has exceeded our individual ability to deliver its benefits correctly, safely, or reliably. How does that sound in your world? Is the volume and complexity of what you know just too much for any one person to handle? Maybe it wasn't always like this. Dr. Gawande writes about master builders, not the Lego ones, but rather the architects who not only designed buildings, but then also often built them. They got their hands dirty. Maybe they knew enough to do both at the time, but somewhere around the Renaissance, this starts to diverge. Builders and architects become separate roles. The complexity of the architecture and the materials means that construction needs specialization. You need masons and bricklayers, and the architects are different. Aviation's gone through this. You can imagine early airplanes, perhaps crafted by the very pilots that flew them. In the 1930s, though, Boeing went to build a bomber for the Army. They were in competition with some other companies. This is the Model 299, their prototype. You can look at it. It's an impressive machine. It's considered the most sophisticated airplane in aviation history around the time. So Boeing had spent years developing this thing. They had a test pilot who wanted to show it off to the Army. So they met the Army one day, October 30th, 1935. Unfortunately, on that one of those maiden voyages, the Model 299 crashed. And two pilots lost their lives. Pete Hill and Boeing's chief test pilot, Leslie Tower, both died from their injuries in the crash. Hill had piloted nearly 60 of the Army Air Corps' newest aircraft, so he was an established pilot. Boeing sent their chief test pilot. These were folks that knew what they were doing, but despite their expertise, around the time of the crash, someone wrote that the Model 299 was perhaps too complex for any one person to understand. This is the cockpit of the Model 299. You can see it's a pretty complicated machine, especially for that time frame. We're going to pause that story for a second, and I'm going to ask you, Denver Startup Week, how complex are your systems? How complex are your services, whether you're event-driven architecture, microservices, monolith? How complex is your stuff? Can any one person understand it? What about your product development process or your agile processes? Does any one person know how everything works? What about incident response when something goes wrong? Well, thankfully, at least in software, when it comes to the code, we have ways of measuring complexity. Literally in the 1970s, a researcher came up with this idea of cyclomatic complexity, a way to measure the intertwining of code, the number of logic statements and different code paths. If you're a Java veteran like myself, perhaps from the mid-2000s, you might remember some tools like Sonar that would help you measure this. There's a newer tool called SCC that I came across that will also help count lines of code. It's just another rough way to measure complexity. Doesn't necessarily mean that more code is more complex, but often that can be the case, certainly just more of it. So let's take a look at SCC. It's pretty easy to download and it's also pretty fast. Hopefully you can see here that it only ran in about a second on my machine. This is analyzing the Discourse code base. Discourse is an open source Rails application used for forums and discussion on websites. You can see that There's about 1 million lines of code in Discourse, about 800,000 once you don't consider blank lines and things like that. The SCC tool will give you a ranking, a score of code complexity. I'm not sure it's fair to compare across projects, but maybe over time, if you look at the complexity of your software, you can see whether it's going up or down. One thing I want to call out is how there's 600 YAML files in the Discourse code base. I would love to hear in the chat, whether now or if you follow up with me on social media, why is there so much YAML in the Discourse repo? I don't know. I want to also highlight the gem file that's used in Discourse. If you're not familiar with Rails, a gem file is a way to express dependencies, much like package JSON for node projects, or maybe your Maven POM file or your Gradle build file in Java land. The Discourse gem file has about 150 lines of code in it, so we can imagine that there's probably over 100 dependencies. So not only does Discourse have its own complexities, it's also relying on other libraries. They have their own systems, their own complexities. Let's look at another project. This is Spring Boot. Spring Boot is a Java application. See, it's mostly Java. It's used for building web apps and web services. See, about almost 400,000 lines of code. It's got a rough complexity score according to SCC of 13,000. Again, not necessarily comparing it to the Discourse app, but maybe something that you can run and measure in your own environment and see what your complexity looks like. It's a cool thing about SCC. It runs on pretty much any language as far as I understand. Pretty neat. Encourage you to check that one out. Now, in the medical community, we can combat complexity with more knowledge. Specialists and experts in each field. If you're undergoing surgery, you're not only going to come across a general surgeon or specialist, but also a radiologist, an anesthesiologist, nurses, maybe a resident student who's following the surgeon. More knowledge, the better, right? And yet there's still mistakes that happen in surgery. Surely you've heard of an instance of someone getting an infection while they were recovering from surgery or something even worse going on. Let's go back to aviation for a second. Now, the Model 299 wasn't a total failure despite that tragic crash early on. See, the pilots, they were experts. They had flown other planes. They had lots of flight hours. And so engineers and other test pilots studied what went wrong in that initial crash. And they realized that Pete Hill had forgotten to release a new locking mechanism on the elevator and rudder controls of the 299. And only a minute into that initial flight, it led to the crash. Well, the 299 went on to become the B-17 Flying Fortress, in part because the engineers looking into the crash realized that pre-flight checklists could help pilots manage the complexity at hand. And with that checklist, the pilots went on to fly the Model 299 a total of 1.8 million miles without a single accident. The Army ultimately ordered almost 13,000 of the aircraft, which was later known as the B-17 Flying Fortress. You can see this is the actual checklist here, at least a page of it anyway. It's fairly straightforward. There's steps before starting the engines, after starting the engines, after takeoff. And around that time, the 1930s, is when aviation checklists were popularized because of this. In the book, Dr. Gwande talks to some civil engineers and construction project managers in the Massachusetts and Boston area. And one of them says essentially that the major advance in the science of construction over the last few decades has been the perfection of tracking and communication. We don't often see construction projects fail. It might be delayed, maybe the wrong materials are ordered. DIA here in Denver certainly having their issues with construction, but yet we don't see crashes of buildings very often, do we? So this idea that perhaps people in construction have learned to communicate well certainly resonates with me. And I want to highlight that idea that the perfection of tracking and communication can be critical to success. And that's to me what the checklist represents, whether it's the B17 checklist or maybe others, that you can start to perfect your tracking and communication across your experts, across your specialists. So do we need checklists in software? Well, maybe we already have them. I think we can perhaps use more of them. Let's dig into that a little bit. Now, certainly I don't want you to walk away from this talk and say, hey, I've got a new form for everyone to fill out. Paperwork is not the goal here. You know, what is the goal is stopping mistakes and being practical and easy to use. Checklists should help manage the complexity, not tell us what to do. And so a good checklist does these 4 things. So let's take a look at how we might implement them in software. If you use Git and GitHub, chances are you've come across Git hooks, which are ways to insert scripts or other tasks in your life cycle of committing code and merging code. Basically gives you a hook, a chance to run something to make sure you don't make a mistake. Let's take a look here. I've got a really simple example of a Golang file. A Golang is kind of natural for this, I feel like, because it has some tools that can both automatically format, lint your code, as well as just check for errors. So we're going to watch a little loop here of where I've written some bad Golang code. I've not only poorly formatted it, but I've used a variable, or I've declared a variable and then not used it. So Go won't even build this, but let's say I just forget. I think, it's a simple change. I don't even need to build it locally. I'm just going to go ahead and commit it. Well, I've got a hook in this repository that's going to prevent me from doing that. It's going to run some of my Golang tools and say, hey, you've got an error there. You're going to need to fix this before I'll let you commit. In this case, that's called a pre-commit hook. And you can check it out in my GitHub repo, the little example there. I'll have some more supporting documentation and maybe a better guide shortly after this talk goes live. Another idea here is preventing secrets from even ever being committed to your code base. There's a nifty little project from some AWS folks called Get Secrets. It's another Git hook you can run. Let's loop this video here. You can see I've got an env file with some AWS secrets in it. And I'm just going to come along one day and be lazy and say, I think this is good. I need to get this out. I need to get these secrets in production. But the Git hook is going to stop me. It's going to say, hey, looks like you're trying to commit some secrets. You sure you want to do that? It's easy to run. You can just run it yourself. Run git secrets --scan. It's another way to do it, but making it a Git hook is even easier. Now, if I forget to run that task, Git will kick in and remind me. So that's great. We can do some things locally on each machine to help us out, prevent mistakes. Sometimes we may even be in a bigger hurry and we may skip those Git hooks. That can be done when you're committing code in Git. You can say, skip all the hooks. I'm in a hurry. And that's where I feel like GitHub Actions play a nice role. So GitHub Actions are a way to essentially run a hook, but on GitHub's side, let GitHub take care of it. So you can specify some code in your repository that will kick in whenever you open a pull request or try to merge something. That will scan your code and do whatever you want. You can be a Docker container or some JavaScript, and I think there's a few more options. In that same repo, I have an example of running some Go vetting and linting tools on my repository whenever there's a pull request. So you can see on the left, I have my checks defined where I'm saying, hey, on a pull request, let's run some Git tools. And you can see on the right where I've tried to push a pull request with some poorly formatted and bad Golang code, and GitHub's prevented me from even doing that. So it's a nice way to help out others by just running this, where maybe say your laptop dies and you're using a new one, you forget to install your local hooks. GitHub Actions can help you out. Another way to do this is when people go to commit code or when they want to go create a pull request, you can have PR and issue templates. that are just sort of helpful reminders. Take a look at what those look like. You can create a file in your Git repo. You can see it on the left. It's called pull request template. It's a markdown file, and basically it becomes a checklist when we want to actually create a pull request. So on the right, you can see I've created the pull request, and I get auto-populated with this template that forces me to stop and kind of consider, what am I doing? Have I finished everything I thought? Are all my tests working? You can also do this for issues, even on private repos. Say, hey, if you're reporting an issue, do you have a test case? Have you seen it? Do you have any links to logs or monitoring? Other things that just force you to stop and remember. So that's looking at some code level tools, but as I kind of previewed earlier, like this isn't just for developers. We have complex systems no matter who you are. But where else can we use checklists in software and product development? Well, we can use it before we write code. If you're designing software architecture, a way to do it is to use what's called an architecture decision record, or ADR. ADRs are essentially a template, checklist, if you will, to fill out to say, what is it that I'm about to build? How are we going to build it? What are the risks? What are the concerns? There's a good GitHub repo. It'll be linked in the speaker notes on this presentation that has some examples of ADR templates. We use ADRs at Handshake. Ours are a slightly different version, but essentially the same thing, so that before engineers start writing code, we can document what we're about to do and get feedback from others and make sure everyone's on the same page. Now, before you even get to that step, maybe you're just trying to decide what kind of decision should we make? What feature should we build? It's a great blog post from Intercom on how they invented job stories. And they use what they call an intermission template that helps them think through product decisions. What problem are we solving and why? What are the stories to be done? How will we measure success? What I love about this intermission template is down there under the notes section. It says, an intermission must always fit on a printed A4 page. If it does not, you don't have a clear enough view of the problem yet. Keep working on it. I love this idea that you really need to hone down your thinking into a single page. Spotify's kind of famous for their feature squads and the way they organize their teams. Well, if you have one team or many teams, perhaps you want to check in, see how they're feeling. Spotify wrote about their squad health check model, which is literally a way to talk to their people and see how they're feeling. Do they feel supported? Do they feel like pawns or players in the game? How's their code base? Are they able to iterate quickly, or do they feel slowed down? So checking on your squads and asking them a series of questions with a nice visualization here is what Spotify does. And to me, it gives us that moment to pause and make sure everybody's on the same page. Perhaps before you take on a big undertaking, you'll do squad health checks across your teams. Everyone feeling good about what we're about to go after. If you're like me, you've perhaps been in a company that's had some mergers or acquisitions, and you've needed to figure out which team is going to handle which feature. Or maybe things are just getting busy and you're growing, you form a new team and they're going to take over a couple of different features. How does that new team know what the feature should do? Are there existing customer commitments? This is a checklist that I'm trying to work on for when this happens. Hopeful to have a blog post about it soon. The idea is that you can run through some steps to say, hey, do we have someone who's going to lead this feature handoff? Do we have time set aside for people to ask questions so that the receiving team of the new feature can get a great head start? I also think checklists can be important for checking our biases. We all have them, and unfortunately, they make it out into public when we release a feature and we don't take in, for example, that maybe we didn't run this AI model on enough data. Maybe we didn't consider all the different types of people in the world. What about a checklist to prevent you from doing that, to say, hey, we're releasing something, have we checked to see if we can recognize dark skin? Have we invited people from around the world to test our product? I think that's super important and a good time to stop and check. Now, we've talked about kind of some slower paced uses of checklists. For example, construction. You might have a couple weeks to fix an issue with your roof. There's also emergencies, especially in the medical field. So in the book, Checklist Manifesto, the author writes about a 3-year-old girl who was submerged in an icy lake for 30 minutes. Following instructions from an emergency physician on the phone, the initial emergency responders began cardiopulmonary resuscitation. A rescue team arrived. The girl had a body temperature of 66 degrees and no pulse. Essentially, she was dead. She had drowned. Yet they took her into the hospital. And later that day, the girl's body was showing signs of life. They did so many procedures that they essentially replaced the blood supply in her body. They brought her heart back to life. And within 2 weeks, or in about 2 weeks, the little girl went home. By age 5, after extensive outpatient therapy, she had recovered her faculties completely. She was like any little girl again. So what happens in our emergencies, and how can we do as good of a job as that medical team did to bring back someone after 30 minutes in an icy lake? Well, that medical team, it wasn't their first time doing that. They had plans and procedures so that when they got the call, they were ready. They knew what to tell the first responders. They knew how to prep the emergency room. Proper planning can really help us out when there is an issue in the middle of the night. And you get that 2 a.m. page. If you have a run book, a guide to what you should be doing or looking at, that's certainly going to help. So plan for those emergencies, create checklists and run books for your team to use. It's a great blog post from Splunk and Victor Ops folks on creating and running your run books using a checklist. Similarly, there's this site, the DevOps checklist, which gives you 48 items you can use to measure where you're at as a software organization to help you know where to stand. You know, if not everyone has access to the logs or to the metrics they might need when something goes down, it's going to be hard for them to respond well in the middle of the night. So this checklist asks things like, do you practice blameless postmortems? And is your system configuration committed to version control? It's a good way to know where to stand and where to invest in some future improvements so that when an emergency does happen, you're ready. Now, a big part of the book is devoted to Dr. Gwande's efforts at the World Health Organization, where they wanted to look at improving outcomes for surgeries worldwide. And this is the surgical safety checklist that was developed by Dr. Gwande and others. You can see it's pretty straightforward. This is literally the checklist. There's 3 columns. Talks about what you should do before anesthesia, before incisions, and before the patient leaves the operating room. I want to highlight a couple things. One spot or one check is to confirm that all team members have been introduced by name and role. And just that simple act of saying your name and what you're there for allows you and your team to feel better about speaking up if there is an issue. If the surgeon's about to make a mistake and the nurse spots it, the nurse can feel comfortable speaking up and the surgeon can pause and make sure everything's correct. Now, this checklist was used across the world in countries both rich and poor, in cities large and small. And no matter where it's been used, it's shown success. So overall, there's been 36% lower issues and poor outcomes as a result of using this checklist in surgery, and even better, a 47% reduction in the number of deaths as a result of surgery and issues that might otherwise come out when these checklists are not used. So I don't know about you, but if I go under surgery anytime soon, I sure hope this checklist is in place. And I sure hope this talk encourages you to use checklists at your startup, your company, maybe even your personal projects. Is there a good time to stop and think, make sure everyone's on the same page? I hope so. You know, in software, we're in an enviable position. We can automate so many checks that you can't necessarily in surgery. And I hope you find some great ways to do that. Thank you so much, Denver Startup Week, for hanging out with me and listening to my talk. You can find me at Virtual Andy on all the internets. My blog, which is in due of a good update there. And I'd like to thank Handshake especially for giving me time and space to think about these kind of things. Love to talk to you more about what we're up to, how we use checklists. We're also hiring, so reach out, say hi. Hope you have a great rest of the week, Denver, and everyone watching around the world. Enjoy. Thanks again. Cool. I see we have a couple questions. I'll try and just answer this newer one live. Feel free to bail. There's 250 great talks at Denver Startup Week. I know we're at kind of like the time limit on mine. Thanks so much for staying tuned. If you can hang out, happy to chat for the next 10 minutes or so. And feel free to reach out on social media, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, LinkedIn, whatever your choice is. Be happy to chat with you. Cool. Let's see. John asks, how does one go about writing good checklists? I've heard many times that devs will write countless bad unit tests before they start to write good ones. Is it similar? Yeah, I would say practicing is probably good. In the book, they talk about checklists have to be like a group activity. You can't have just one person come in and say, here's the form we're all going to fill out. Like it's not very inclusive. You might have missed something. And so kind of bringing in a group of people to help with that could be important. I think kind of those 4 bullet points, they should be easy to use. They should be efficient, practical. They should help stop mistakes. That can be like a good place to start as well. So if there's some mistake that you've now seen more than once, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me kind of thing. So if you see the mistake twice, perhaps that's a good time to implement some kind of check. And just try and put a stop to that if possible. And then if you find another mistake, like add to that. That's one of my favorite things about run books, I think, is like that playbook of what happens when things go wrong. You're not going to know until probably it goes wrong a few times. And then you might learn and go, all right, we want to make sure that when this thing falls over, we know what to do. That kind of scenario. So hopefully that helps. Yeah. I think you can get started with checklists and kind of see where they go. Are they useful? Maybe a retrospective after you've used the checklist a couple of times would be a good idea. Like, did that actually help us? Did that save us any time? That kind of thing. Cool. I think that gets a little bit too to what Carl mentioned in the chat, which is like, there's some checklists where you kind of need to stop and use them before you actually do anything. And there's others that maybe are better off when you already know what to do and you just want sort of a guide or a check later on. And so, it's maybe certain checks are not meant to be acknowledged before actually doing something, but give you an escape hatch or a way to respond when something does happen or does go wrong. And so, whether that's monitoring or alerting, or maybe even just some kind of smoke tests in production that say, oh, you know what, this feature suddenly stopped working. What just happened? And it just kind of checks on that for you. In my experience, I've had some good success with just really simple Slack bots. So you have a Slack bot that maybe just messages the team when, say, a new integration is configured. And the team can kind of be on the lookout like, this can be a complicated task to set up this integration. Maybe the user has to enter some webhook secrets or something like that. And it can be just kind of confusing or often error prone. And so having a little Slack bot that just pops up and goes, hey, someone just set up a new integration, reach out to their success team, make sure it's going well after 24 hours. Things like that, I think, can be pretty useful. Cool. Hopefully that covers that. Yeah, again, feel free to reach out through social media. Find me online. Hope you all have a great week at Denver Startup Week Virtual Edition 2020. Big thanks again to Quizlet for sponsoring the developer track, all the sponsors for the week overall, especially all the volunteers. Big thanks to them for running this kind of thing. And if there's no other questions, happy to sign off, and we'll see you all out there. All right. Have a good one.